The extreme suffering arguments for antinatalism. Introduction. I would like to present a collection of arguments that make heavy use of the experiences of extreme suffering to argue that we should not procreate. These arguments have a major advantage over the arguments that merely point to the inevitability of some suffering in one's life, namely, they are immune to the common objection that a mere pinch worth of pain makes life not worth starting. What is extreme suffering? It is difficult to explain what extreme suffering is and how it is different from ordinary or even high-intensity suffering. People often say that there simply are no words or any means of conveying how bad it is. They often say that they would have wanted to die than to have to go through these experiences. Examples of extreme suffering. The best way to convey what we mean by extreme suffering is to point to some clear examples. Brian Tomasic and Simon Knudsen have collected a bunch, so I'll just list them briefly. Burning alive, being roasted alive in a bronze container, being subjected to various Middle Ages torture techniques, factory farming, being skinned alive, waking up during surgery, colonoscopy, rape with extreme violence. Radical features of extreme suffering. About such experiences, we can say that no one thinks to themselves they should just endure it. They want only that the pain stops. There is no growth from it. There is only trauma, mutilation, degradation, scarring, loss, debilitation as long-lasting effects. If one even survives, often such experiences are fatal. The arguments from extreme suffering. We will now go through the arguments. Argument 1. The possibility of extreme suffering. 1. Once brought into existence, it's possible that the child will be subjected to extreme suffering. 2. One will do almost anything to prevent their child from experiencing extreme suffering. 3. Not procreating makes it impossible for the potential child to go through extreme suffering. Conclusion. To protect one's potential child from extreme suffering, one has to not bring them into existence. In support of premise 1, we say that there always is a possibility that anyone will go through extreme suffering. If so, then it's possible that one's own child will undergo extreme suffering. In support of premise 2, we say that one can build up a loving relationship to one's prospective child that is similar to the attitude towards their living loved ones. Because everyone understands they would do anything to not suffer terribly, they also understand how it would feel for their children. As an explanation of premise 3, we say that if the child will not be brought into existence, he or she won't even be here to potentially experience extreme suffering. Abstention from procreation is not itself an instance of extreme suffering. That's why it is a viable course of action. We concluded that one has to refrain from procreation to make sure their potential child will not undergo extreme suffering. Argument 2. The impossibility to guarantee protection from extreme suffering. 1. Procreation is justified only if one guarantees the child will not undergo extreme suffering. 2. One cannot guarantee that their child will not be subjected to extreme suffering. Conclusion: procreation is never justified. In support of premise 1, we say that bringing a child into existence puts the child into a situation where it's possible he or she will experience extreme suffering. Because the prospective parent will do almost anything to guarantee their child will not be subjected to extreme suffering, The parent has to guarantee that the child will not go through extreme suffering during the child's entire life. In support of premise 2, we say that it is impossible to predict the future, and because it's impossible to predict the future, it's impossible to control the future in such a way as to guarantee that one's own child will not experience extreme suffering. In short, bringing someone into existence is never justified because it's impossible to guarantee that the child will not undergo extreme suffering. Argument 3. Perpetuation of humanity necessitates extreme suffering of some people. 1. As long as humans procreate, there will be some people who will go through extreme suffering. 2. We would do almost anything to prevent extreme suffering, including not having children. Conclusion. Humans should stop procreating to ensure no one will go through extreme suffering. In support of premise 1, we say that every now and then someone is born who goes through extreme suffering. Even if the vast majority lives a joyful life, there will be some who suffer the worst that life has to offer. As long as humanity exists, some people will experience extreme suffering. Premise 2 is a combination of universal attitudes towards extreme suffering. In short, humanity has to stop reproducing to make sure no one in the future is subjected to extreme suffering. Additional points on extreme suffering. Before going further, let's make a few additional remarks about extreme suffering. Attitudes towards extreme suffering. In general, we observe certain universal attitudes towards extreme suffering. 1. One will do anything to avoid and escape from extreme suffering. Even suicide is on the table. 2. One does not want one's loved ones to undergo extreme suffering. 3. We would like to do almost anything to prevent anyone else from experiencing extreme suffering, except go through the agony ourselves or subject our loved ones to it. 4. Abstention from procreation is not extreme suffering. 5. Normally, we wouldn't even wish extreme suffering on our enemies. The only exceptions are when we're under overwhelming emotions. But in the normal state, where we are rational, we wouldn't even subject the so-called evil people to extreme suffering. 6. It is reasonable, justifiable, humane, benevolent, and compassionate to terminate a pregnancy when it is known the child would undergo extreme suffering if the pregnancy is carried to term. Is extreme suffering preventable? One can object that we should rather work on trying to predict and prevent extreme suffering. But is this possible? The reasoning we're following is this. 1. If people could predict extreme suffering, it would have been prevented. 2. Extreme suffering happens frequently. Conclusion. Therefore, people cannot predict and prevent all instances of extreme suffering. And the conclusion is enough. Even if we could predict and hence prevent some instances of extreme suffering, that would not be enough to counter the argument. If we cannot predict all instances of extreme suffering, the argument works. As an example, take someone living in 1905. This person may live in Japan, Germany, Ukraine. She thinks whether her child will have an overall good life. She would have to predict 2 world wars, German concentration camps with experiments on people, Americans building and using nuclear weapons on civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the great starvation in Ukraine that resulted in frequent acts of cannibalism. Was it possible to predict any of that to relocate to secure her child's future? No, it wasn't. Such events are unpredictable, and so they cannot be accounted for nor prevented. The strengths of the arguments from extreme suffering. There are some arguments for antinatalism that have some very unintuitive conclusions. For example, Benatar's argument from the benefits and harms asymmetry is constructed in such a way that even when someone in their whole life would experience only the pain of stabbing one's toe, this would be enough to say that it would have been better for him not to come into existence. This conclusion is very unintuitive, and some people objected it is absurd, which is why the argument should be rejected. The arguments presented above cannot be attacked using this objection, as we are not talking about an arbitrary pain, but about extreme suffering, which is unequivocally bad, and we would do almost anything to avoid it and not allow it to happen to anyone else. It is reasonable to agree that it would have been better never to exist than to be born and experience extreme suffering. Another common objection against antinatalist arguments is to say that since most people are happy they have been born, it's fine to procreate. However, since we would do almost anything to avoid our potential child from being subjected to extreme suffering, it does not matter that most people are happy. We would have to guarantee the child will be safe, but this is impossible. Conclusion. We've seen that extreme suffering is so terrible we would do almost anything to avoid it, and we would do almost anything to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. We wouldn't even wish it to our grave enemies. When procreating, we make it possible that the child will go through extreme suffering, and we cannot guarantee they will not suffer the agony. So we have to abstain from procreation as individuals and as humanity as a whole.